Let's jump into Psalm 18. We left off yesterday with God's deliverance of David. David expressing in verses about 7 through 17 God's divine intervention, how he intervened in David's life, and he brought him out of a large place, delivered him, delighted in him. Now, coming into verse 20, well, let's read verses 20 through 28, okay? The Lord, new paragraph, okay? The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands hath he recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me. I did not put away his statutes from me. I was also upright before him, and I kept myself from mine iniquity. Therefore hath the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of mine hands in his eyesight. With the merciful thou wilt show thyself merciful. With an upright man thou wilt show thyself upright. With the pure thou wilt show thyself pure. And with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward. For thou wilt save the afflicted people, but wilt bring down high looks. For thou wilt light my candle, the Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. Now, verse 20 through 28 begins to expound God's reward for David's faithfulness, okay? Now, the reason I'm cautiously entering into this passage is because this is a responsive faithfulness, a responsive righteousness that then God is equally responsive, or maybe in an extra measure responsive. Let me explain what I'm saying. David had already placed his faith, his saving faith in God. In an Old Testament understanding of the gospel, David knew he was sinful before God, and he deserved God's judgment and justice, but God conferred upon him salvation and favor, grace, grace-based love, grace-based forgiveness. That is the essence of salvation. In other words, we don't present God our righteousness and demand that he save us or that he forgive us on the merit of our righteousness, okay? But here's what God does. God confers upon us his righteousness through Jesus, through the work of the cross, by faith. He grants us his favor, his righteousness, his love. He births us into his family, and then he grows us in that righteousness. And as we live out that righteousness, as we obey him, as we are faithful to him, as we live in honor and integrity, and as that purity of God comes out of us, God then turns around and blesses and rewards that same faithfulness. So even though it is his grace producing the faithfulness, he then turns around when we choose to live in honor to him. He then turns around and blesses us with an extra measure of blessing. I heard so often in my life, obedience brings blessing, and it does, but it's blessing on top of blessing. In other words, the fountain of God's blessing is we've already received in Jesus Christ. He's already given us all of his love and all of himself. And so what David is appealing, or David is describing here, is not a saving kind of blessing or a saving kind of righteousness that like he was good enough for God to save him. No, he's simply expressing that in the calamity, when he was being dealt with unjustly, he chose God's path. He chose righteousness, purity, integrity. He chose to obey God, even though he was being dealt with unjustly. He chose not to avenge himself or to fight for himself or to do the wrong thing. And so the Lord, verse 20, the Lord rewarded him according to that righteous response. So you have God reaching out and saving David based on his own grace and his own righteousness, conferring upon David righteousness. Then you have David behaving righteously in response to God's love and saving grace and work of grace in his life. Now David's behaving righteously. He's behaving in integrity. He's behaving with obedience and faithfulness. And then you have God responding to that and rewarding that and blessing that and applauding that. So God saves us from our sin, gives us the ability to live rightly before him, motivates that by his grace and spirit, and then cheers us on and blesses us when we do. It is an amazing, amazing picture. And this is what Hebrews means when it says that without faith it's impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, that's salvation, and that he rewards those that diligently seek him. So God is a savior, but he's also a blesser. He is a blesser unconditionally, but he is a blesser abundantly. He pours out his favor when we choose to obey, when we choose to honor. Another way to look at this is there are rewards intrinsic to salvation. Saving faith in God, it just lavishes us with all the love and grace of God. But then there are blessings intrinsic to obedience. Doing right brings reward, and it's not merely performance based. But it's like the outflow of it's how God designed righteousness to work. Righteousness has its rewards. Okay, doing right ends up in the end game. Right, in the long view, in the long picture, right might be the hard path. Right might be the tough path. Obedience might be the risky or the high road, the difficult road. It might be in the short term, the more costly path. But obeying God always brings with it boatloads of intrinsic reward and value that makes you, in the end, always glad you obeyed him. What David is showing us in verses 20 through 28 is that he obeyed God when it was so difficult to obey God. And when everybody else would have said, fight for your cause, fight for justice, avenge yourself, take your enemy's life. And yet he chose righteousness. He chose cleanness of his hands, is one way he describes it. He kept the ways of the Lord. He did this God's way. That's verse 21. He chose not to wickedly depart from God. In other words, as believers, we can do our own thing wickedly. We can choose our own way. We can rebel against God as his children. And he says it kept all of his judgments, all of God's wisdom, all of God's perspective was before him. He didn't put away any of his statutes. Verse 23 says, I was upright before him. I kept myself from iniquity. David's saying, I chose the right path. I stayed away from sin. This is all practical behavioral stuff that David's saying in the season of distress and temptation, when I had all these opportunities to do the wrong thing, I chose to do the right thing. Okay. And then verse 24, the Lord recompensed, the Lord rewarded, the Lord responded to my choices of right, my choices of righteousness and obedience. He responded to my choice for cleanness and purity and integrity in his eyesight. He rewarded that. So what a great challenge this morning, that David had the opportunity to do the wrong thing. He chose to look up. He chose to find his refuge in God, his vengeance in the Lord's timing and the Lord's providence. He chose to wait. While he's waiting, he is waiting on God and in God. He's waiting for deliverance, but he's making wise choices in the time of distress. And one of the big takeaways today is that the choices you make in a time of distress, they matter massively. They matter incredibly. If you're in a time of distress, if COVID is still for you a time of distress, listen to David's words. Look at David's path. He's choosing purity, integrity, cleanness, righteousness. He's choosing to do the right thing before God. He's choosing honor when everything in life might be tempting him to dishonor, to do something destructive, to do something wrong, to compromise his integrity, to compromise his testimony, to take some easy escape hatch, to get out, of the situation. But he refused to do that. He took the hard road. He took the high road. He took the right road. He chose God's way. And in verses 20 down through 28, he is expressing, now looking back, he's glad he took the high road. So, my friend, I'm going to leave it right there today. We'll break this down a little more. But when you're tempted to take the escape road, when you're tempted to run, when you're tempted to do the wrong thing, choose right, do right, honor God, do the hard thing. God will honor you for it in ways that are providential, in ways that are beyond your control. God's going to recompense. He's going to reward. He's going to bless when you do the right thing. Okay? You do right, you're untying God's hands and letting him have his way. And his way is always going to be eventually in your favor, in your best interest. So choose right even when it's hard. Think of David doing right in the hardest of moments. And now this psalm is a celebration of how in those hard moments, God reached in providentially, supernaturally intervened and rewarded David's patient, faithful doing of right. Don't get tired doing what's right. Be not weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. There it is. That's the principle. David never wearied of doing right. And if you will follow that example, you'll live to celebrate that decision, and so will those that you love.